I thought that the George W. Bush, not George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush production of that funeral in the Washington's National Cathedral was as phenomenal of a celebration of life as a funeral could be. It was extraordinary in all respects. I thought if you didn't watch it, go out on YouTube, grab some of those videos, watch some of those tributes. I dare you, if you have a soul, to not find yourself crying. I thought that John Meacham was great. I thought the former Prime Minister of Canada was outstanding. Alan Simpson, the former senator from Wyoming. And then in what has to be an incredibly difficult thing to do, to eulogize your own father in such a public forum like George W. Bush did. Again, a eulogy in general is insanely difficult to give, but a public eulogy where you know the audience is going to be in the tens of millions of people watching you all around the world. I thought George W. Bush did a phenomenal job on that eulogy. I thought that there were a couple of lines that were fantastic. One of them was legitimately funny, talking about how the senior Bush had such a good sense of humor, and George W. Bush said, and you know that because he let Simpson speak at the funeral. Unbelievable delivery of that joke. That's one of the funniest jokes I've ever heard in a funeral setting ever. I mean, just a phenomenal delivery, outstanding. The anecdotes that were told, again, I've been told you guys that I've been reading a lot about World War II, and to me, that is truly, they were the greatest generation. And when you think about George W. Bush at 20 years, George Bush Sr., this is why you shouldn't name your kids after you. When you think about George Bush Sr. at 20 years old, flying that airplane in September of 1944, doing a bombing run, having his airplane struck, having his 2 crew members bail out, and then bailing out on his own and being rescued by a submarine floating in the Pacific in a life raft. It is utterly unbelievable. Just unbelievable to think about what those guys did, how brave they were. I don't know if you saw the video of Bob Dole at 95 years old standing and saluting the casket of George Bush Sr. It was an ennobling experience. And I have asked this question in general. Would our generation, or any generation for that matter, be capable of combating actual evil? This generation that we have now is very good at combating evil thoughts, things that make them sad on social media. How many people, and again, we're talking about the masses, there are undoubtedly great citizens who are soldiers today, right? There are great leaders in all of our military. But when you have to mobilize pretty much the entire country to fight a war, would we be capable of marshaling that kind of unity to fight a war today? I genuinely question whether it would be possible and whether the people who would need to fight, the young men primarily, right, that are going to be fighting that war, whether they would have the balls to do the things that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers did. How many people do you feel comfortable today would actually be brave enough to march into a cold, awful, stormy beachhead like they did at Normandy into a hail of Nazi bullets? I've said this before, but that generation fought actual Nazis. The modern day younger generation, it's actually younger than millennials, spends all day calling people Nazis on Twitter who have different opinions than they do. It's an amazing transition in the world from fighting actual Nazis and risking your life at the age of 18 or 19 years old to fighting made-up people on the internet who have different opinions than you and are therefore modern-day Nazis. There's really no similarity. And I read the great book about E Company in the 101st Airborne and their service overseas. And what stood out to me is an anecdote that I'll be talking about for the rest of my life. Those guys in the 101st Airborne, the paratroopers, most of them, I want you to think about, you want to talk about big brass balls. I want you to think about this for a minute. Most of those guys, the first time that they stepped onto an airplane in their lives, they parachuted out of it. I want you to think about how unbelievable that is for a moment. The very first time they got onto an airplane in their life, all these small town boys who got drafted to go fight against Adolf Hitler and the Germans, the very first time they got onto an airplane, they stepped off the airplane with a parachute on their back. You want to talk about big brass balls. Can you imagine the bravery that it takes? The very first time, Band of Brothers is the book, Easy Company. The very first time that they got on an airplane, they jumped off the airplane with a parachute on their back. It's an unbelievable story. And what those guys went through is extraordinary as we lose more and more World War II veterans every day. I think what they were capable of and what they accomplished is going to become more legendary when they are no longer here. And what I mean by that is oftentimes history doesn't understand how enormous someone's work was until they are gone and they move from flesh and blood into legend. And I think we're in the process, and for anybody out there who studies history, of really truly starting to understand how legendary they are. And people out there don't understand, these are not professional soldiers. There's a difference between a professional soldier, which is a tiny segment of the population that serves now, right? I'm talking about your average guy who was a school teacher, and the next thing you know, he's got a gun and he's fighting Nazis. That just is mind-blowing to me. And it is extraordinary to think about what they actually went through. And again, I believe as they die off, that they will become more legendary because people will look back at what they accomplished and you won't believe that it was ever possible. And it is extraordinary to think about, and that's kind of what I thought as I watched George H.W. Bush. And I'll be honest, I think I take it a little bit for granted because I'm 39, so I grew up with a lot of World War II veterans around you. And you think about, or at least I did, the Civil War, right? That's the war that kind of was mythologized for me. But for my son's generations, as they study history, what they find to be overwhelming and unbelievable is World War II. So I just thought everything about that was a phenomenal way to say goodbye, not just to George H.W. Bush, but to the people from their generation who are all leaving us now. And I also thought it was incredibly iconic to be in that moment. And they talked about him as a citizen soldier and the last of his kind. You had lined up Donald Trump, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and Jimmy Carter. I don't believe any of them served in the military. Maybe Jimmy Carter did. I know Clinton dodged the draft in Vietnam. Obama's young enough that there was never a draft. And Donald Trump also dodged the draft, like a lot of rich people did in that era. I thought also seeing all those presidents lined up with all the vice presidents right behind them, all of those incredibly iconic, larger-than-life figures reduced to their barest humanity, sitting there on the front row as they are aging, doubtless thinking about the fact that not too long from now, probably, we will all be watching their funerals as well. Jimmy Carter is over 90, Bill Clinton over 70, Donald Trump over 70, Barack Obama is much younger than everybody else, and I'm sure those guys will have, hopefully, good health and continue to live as long as possible. But having 6 living presidents was a rarity, And I just thought it was an iconic moment to be able to see all of that in one place. It was riveting. It was incredible theater. It was hard to look away from what an incredible show that was of respect and admiration, and the best, I think, of our country going forward.